unaware his wife secretly owned the company he bragged about. He let his mistress slap her in front of their kids on Christmas Eve. But months later, she walked into a board meeting he wasn't allowed to enter. He didn't just fail her as a husband. He failed her as a father, in his own living room, beneath Christmas lights and in front of their children, while another woman stood where his wife should have been. On Christmas Eve, with wrapping paper still on the floor and the kids clutching half-open toys, Nicholas Holland stood next to a woman in a bright red dress, his colleague, Marla Gray, and bragged about the company he claimed he had built from nothing. "This is what pressure looks like," he said loudly, arm brushing Marla's. "Elaine doesn't really understand business." Across the room, Elaine Connor, his quiet wife, the one who cooked the meals, calmed the kids, and stayed out of the spotlight, and stood near the tree, hands folded so the children wouldn't see them tremble. To everyone else, she was just the soft-spoken mother in a simple dress, the woman who didn't get it, the one who should be grateful. Marla stepped closer, smiling with practiced sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "Some people don't belong everywhere they're invited," she said, gaze locked on Elaine. And then, in front of the children, in front of family, in front of a man who was supposed to protect her, Marla raised her hand and slapped Elaine across the face. The room went silent. Nicholas didn't move. He didn't shield his wife. He looked at her with disgust and said, "Clear enough for everyone to hear. You brought this on yourself. Always a burden." What most people in that room didn't know, not Nicholas, not Marla, not the relatives clutching their phones, was that the woman they just humiliated already held something far more powerful than their approval. The company Nicholas bragged about like a trophy, on paper, in trusts and signatures he'd skimmed but never really understood, it had never truly been his. Months later, when he walked down a quiet hallway toward a board meeting and found the door locked to him but opening for her, that Christmas Eve would come back to him in a way he could never escape. Dear viewers, thank you for being here. If you watch without subscribing, it's like leaving Elaine standing alone in that living room while everyone else looks away. When you hit that button, you stand with every quiet soul who was mocked, erased, yet still rose. Please subscribe now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The room was loud with laughter, glasses clinking, voices overlapping, and at the center of it stood 38-year-old Nicholas Holland, confident, polished, halfway through another story about himself. He lifted his glass higher than necessary, enjoying the way conversations bent toward him. They usually did. He was tall, well-dressed, the kind of man people assumed was successful before he ever opened his mouth. And once he did, he made sure no one doubted it. He spoke about his company, his sacrifices, his long nights carrying the weight of everyone else. Just behind him, half a step back, stood his wife, 35-year-old Elaine Connor. She wasn't holding a drink. She was holding a small plate, one hand steadying it, the other resting lightly at her side, a posture learned over years of not interrupting. Her expression was calm, almost gentle, but her eyes stayed alert, tracking the room the way mothers always did, checking exits, counting heads, making sure the children hadn't wandered too far. Nicholas laughed mid-sentence and said something about how pressure wasn't for everyone, how some people stayed home, sheltered, while others built empires. He didn't look at Elaine when he said it, but the pause afterward made it clear who he meant. Elaine smiled faintly. She always did. To outsiders, it looked like patience. To family, it looked like loyalty. To Nicholas, it looked like proof that he was right, that she knew her place and accepted it. No one in the room noticed the thin leather folder tucked under Elaine's arm. Dark brown, worn at the edges. Always with her when paperwork was involved, always quiet, always closed. Elaine had a habit that confused people who thought they knew her. She let other people take credit. At home, that habit looked like calm. At family dinners, it looked like silence. In her marriage, it looked like devotion, the kind that never corrected, never challenged, never embarrassed. Nicholas loved telling the story of his rise. He told it often, at work mixers, at holidays, even to strangers in line. He described how he had saved a struggling logistics company, how he had taken risks, how he had shouldered responsibility while Elaine focused on the children. She wouldn't understand that kind of pressure, he liked to say, shaking his head with a practiced smile. Elaine would excuse herself then, check on the kids, refill a cup, anything to keep the peace intact. But the truth of Elaine Connor didn't begin with Nicholas. It began years earlier, long before his speeches and the applause. Elaine grew up in rooms filled with documents, not noise. Her father, Aaron Dickerson, had been a quiet man with steady hands and careful eyes. He ran a regional logistics company, Dickerson Freight, that never chased attention, but never failed either. Trucks moved on time, contracts were honored, people were paid. When Elaine was young, she used to sit at the corner of his desk doing homework while he reviewed reports. He didn't simplify things for her, he explained them. Ownership isn't about being loud, he once told her, sliding a document toward her. It's about responsibility, and the people who shout the most usually understand it the least. When Aaron died unexpectedly, Elaine was 26. People assumed his brothers or some longtime manager would take over. Instead, lawyers gathered in a quiet conference room and explained what Aaron had arranged years earlier. Through carefully structured shares, Elaine became the controlling owner of Dickerson Freight, not publicly, not loudly, but legally and completely. The board knew, the lawyers knew. A professional trustee was appointed to vote the shares according to her written instructions. To the outside world, though, the company looked like it belonged to a cluster of institutional investors. Advisors suggested she step forward, take the title, sit at the head of the table. Elaine chose something else. She remembered her father's voice, low and deliberate, in one of their last serious talks. If you ever love someone proud, he had said, protect yourself quietly. Don't argue with ego, prepare for it. So she did. Years later, when the board recruited an ambitious operations manager named Nicholas Holland to modernize systems and drive growth, Elaine watched his early performance from a distance. He was undeniably talented, charismatic. He brought in new contracts, staff liked him, revenue climbed. He also loved attention. He talked a little too long in meetings, took up a little too much space in discussions, but back then, it still looked like confidence, not contempt. Elaine met him at a company event, not as the owner, but as the founder's daughter visiting old colleagues. He was drawn to her calm, her steadiness, her refusal to be impressed by his jokes. They fell in love, or something close enough that she believed in it. When they married, Elaine placed her shares into a blind family trust. She appointed an independent legal custodian. She kept her name off any document Nicholas ever glanced at in daily operations. On paper, the trust was the majority owner. Inside sealed instructions, only the trustee and company counsel saw Elaine's full authority. At home, it was almost never mentioned. Not because Nicholas asked her to hide it, because she saw what ambition did to him. She saw how his confidence sharpened when he felt admired, how his tone shifted when he felt superior, how quickly pride replaced partnership. Elaine chose love over visibility, believing, at the time, that silence was safer. Back in the present, Nicholas finished his story to another round of approval. Someone clapped him on the shoulder, someone called him impressive. Elaine felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not pain, not yet, but awareness. She noticed things others didn't, how Nicholas barely skimmed contracts anymore, how he signed where he was told. How certain letters from the trustee never crossed the kitchen table because Elaine redirected them first, asking counsel for clarification before forwarding anything he needed to see. She had been correcting legal language quietly for years, fixing mistakes before they mattered, protecting him from consequences he didn't know he was courting. He mistook that protection for weakness. As the gathering continued, Elaine stepped away, slipping into the hallway to check on the children. Their laughter grounded her. Their trust reminded her why she had stayed quiet for so long. Behind her, Nicholas began another story, this one about his board, about how his company was moving into a new phase, about how he was finally getting the recognition he deserved. Elaine paused just long enough to listen. She didn't turn around. She didn't correct him. She didn't interrupt. She simply held the leather folder a little tighter, because silence, she knew, was only powerful when it was chosen. And one day soon, Nicholas Holland would mistake that silence for something else entirely. A woman who doesn't speak, he would think, is a woman who has nothing to say. The house lights dimmed as the evening wound down. Elaine ushered the children toward their coats, already sensing a shift in the air the way pride was hardening into something sharper. Something that would soon invite another presence into their lives, someone who wouldn't stay half a step behind. Elaine didn't know her name yet, but she could already feel the space being cleared. In the next room, Nicholas laughed again, unaware that the story he loved telling was standing quietly behind him, waiting for the moment it would finally be told differently. Just, don't embarrass me tonight. The words landed hard, sharp enough to cut through the quiet of the bedroom. Nicholas stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, jaw tight, eyes fixed on his own reflection. He didn't look at Elaine when he said it. He didn't need to. The sentence wasn't an invitation to respond, it was a warning. Elaine froze for half a second. She was already dressed a simple, soft-colored dress, chosen because it was comfortable and easy to move in. The kids were with a sitter. She had planned to be home early. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. She studied Nicholas's reflection instead of her own, the impatience in his movements, the faint irritation pulling at the corners of his mouth. It's just stress, she told herself. A big quarter, a coming board review. That's what marriage was, she reminded herself, absorbing pressure so it didn't spill everywhere else. She nodded once, quiet, automatic. Nicholas exhaled, satisfied, and grabbed his phone. The screen lit up briefly before he turned it face down again. It buzzed once, then stopped, Elaine noticed. She always noticed. The event space buzzed with energy, low music, clinking glasses, clusters of people dressed to impress. Nicholas seemed to expand the moment he walked in. His shoulders straightened, his voice grew louder. People turned toward him without being asked. Nick, tell us how you pulled that off. Nicholas laughed, warm and confident. He started telling the story again, the one about rescuing Dickerson Freet, about late nights, about pressure Elaine wouldn't understand. Elaine stood beside him, half a step back. At first she stayed quiet, let him talk, let him shine. That had always been their unspoken agreement. But when someone asked about a recent shipment delay, Elaine spoke softly, instinctively. It was weather-related, she said. The rerouting. Nicholas waved his hand without turning toward her. You wouldn't understand, he said lightly, smiling at the group. She doesn't really know business. The laughter that followed was polite, controlled, safe. Elaine felt the heat rush to her face, then drain away just as fast. She took a step back, physically giving him more space, as if shrinking might make the moment disappear. He didn't notice. Or worse, he did. As the night went on, Elaine watched the shift solidify. Nicholas leaned closer to the people praising him. He interrupted others now, corrected them, claimed victories that had never been his alone. When Elaine placed a hand lightly on his arm to remind him of time, he brushed it away. Handle it, he muttered under his breath. I'm busy. The word handle echoed in her chest. Later, Elaine stepped out onto the balcony for air. That was when she heard the laughter. Not the polite kind from inside. This was lower, intimate, confident. Nicholas stood a few feet away, phone pressed to his ear, posture relaxed in a way Elaine hadn't seen in months. You're right, he said quietly, a smile curling at his mouth. She doesn't get it. Some people are just liabilities. The word hit Elaine harder than the insult earlier. Liability. He laughed again, softer this time, and turned away slightly, lowering his voice. Elaine stepped back into the shadows before he could see her. She didn't confront him, not then. She didn't cry. She didn't demand answers. Instead, she began collecting details. The changes came quickly after that. Passwords stopped working. Shared accounts needed verification. Nicholas grew defensive when she asked simple questions. Her joint debit card declined once at the grocery store, just long enough for the cashier to apologize, just long enough for a stranger behind her to sigh impatiently. Elaine called the bank from her car. The representative explained that large transfers had been made into a business operations account Nicholas controlled. That night, Nicholas blamed the bank. Later, when she asked why he hadn't told her, he blamed her. You've always been bad with money, he snapped. You spend too much. You don't know pressure like I do. Elaine stared at him, searching his face for the man she married. The one who used to listen. The one who used to say, we. She found something else instead. Resentment. And beneath it, contempt. When he called her dead weight for the first time, the words settled into the room like dust, coating everything it touched. He didn't apologize. He didn't soften it. He said it like a fact. Elaine said nothing. Silence had become her shield. That night, after the children were asleep, Elaine sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. She reached for the thin leather folder she hadn't opened in months. Inside were documents she knew by heart, trust agreements, ownership clauses, protections her father had insisted on. She read them again slowly, grounding herself in their language. Everything was still intact. Everything was still protected, financially at least. But as Elaine closed the folder, she felt something shift inside her, a realization settling deeper than fear. Protection, she understood now, didn't stop disrespect. It didn't stop humiliation, and it certainly didn't stop someone who believed your silence meant you had no power left to lose. Elaine turned off the kitchen light and stood there in the dark for a moment, listening to Nicholas's muffled voice upstairs, laughing into his phone again. A laugh she didn't recognize anymore. Somewhere in that laughter, she sensed, there was room being made for someone else. And when that someone arrived, Elaine knew the cruelty would no longer be quiet. The next insult wouldn't be spoken behind her back. Elaine first saw Marla Gray standing where Elaine usually stood. The realization hit her like a sudden drop in the stomach, sharp, immediate, disorienting. It was a small pre-holiday gathering, nothing formal. Just a few colleagues, a few friends, lights strung too neatly to feel casual. Nicholas had insisted on hosting some key people from work at the house. Elaine had stepped into the room with practiced calm, already scanning for the children, already bracing for Nicholas's mood on a night tied to company politics. And then she saw it. Her place was taken. Not aggressively, not loudly, just occupied. The woman wore red, not festive red, not soft red, but confident, red-fitted, deliberate, the kind of color chosen by someone who expected to be seen. She stood close to Nicholas, angled slightly toward him, body relaxed, one hand resting lightly on the back of the chair Elaine usually used during these gatherings. Nicholas didn't move her. That was the first shock. He smiled instead. "Elaine," he said, voice bright, almost overeager. "This is Marla Gray. She's important at work." The pause before important lingered longer than it should have. Elaine nodded politely. She offered her hand. Marla took it loosely, eyes flicking over Elaine's fingers, her shoes, the cut of her dress, a slow, assessing scan that felt less like curiosity and more like measurement. "So this is her," Marla said, smiling as if she were confirming something to herself. Elaine felt the heat rise but kept her posture steady. Marla leaned closer to Nicholas and murmured something too quiet to hear. Nicholas laughed, not his polite laugh, but the one he used when he felt admired. Elaine stepped aside, instinctively giving space. No one noticed. Marla Gray was younger than Elaine by a few years, early 30s, polished, sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who spoke with certainty, using words like efficiency and strategy like they were moral virtues. Elaine learned who she was quickly. Marla was an outside operations consultant, brought in, Nicholas said, to streamline things and get the company ready for real growth. He talked about her ideas with excitement he hadn't shown Elaine in months. He repeated Marla's phrases at dinner, nodding as if they were revelations. "She sees the bigger picture," he said once. "She's not emotional about it." The words landed like a quiet accusation. That first night, Elaine heard Marla's voice again in the hallway. "She's sweet," Marla said, not unkindly, "but soft. You've outgrown that." Elaine stood frozen just beyond the doorway, breath shallow, heart thudding in her ears. Nicholas didn't disagree. That was worse than if he had. From that night on, Marla didn't fade, she expanded. At the office, staff saw her in meetings she technically wasn't supposed to lead. At home, she began appearing in stories. Nicholas told Marla suggested this. Marla says that's outdated until her name floated through their dining room, more often than Elaine's. Then she started showing up in person, first as the consultant who happened to be nearby, dropping in after late meetings to continue urgent discussions at the house. Then as a regular presence, arriving before Elaine finished setting the table, offering to help in a way that never actually helped. She moved through Elaine's kitchen with ease, commenting on decor, opening cabinets, standing too close to Nicholas. Once Elaine found her pouring coffee from Elaine's mug. "You don't mind, right?" Marla said lightly, already sipping. "I feel like I'm practically family now." Elaine forced a smile. Marla corrected Elaine in front of others. About schedules, about plans, about things Elaine had managed quietly for years. She laughed softly at Elaine's clothes once, tilting her head. "You're very Simple, she said. It's refreshing. Some people try too hard. Nicholas chuckled. Elaine stopped laughing with them after that. The first time Elaine tried to talk to Nicholas about it, she chose her moment carefully. The children were asleep. The house was quiet. I feel pushed aside, Elaine said calmly. She crosses boundaries. Nicholas sighed, rubbing his face. You're overreacting, he said. She's helping me. Don't make this a thing. Don't make this a thing. The sentence slammed a door. After that, Nicholas stopped pretending. Marla did too. She took Elaine's usual seat at the table without asking. She leaned into Nicholas during conversations. She made comments about upgrades and moving forward, always glancing at Elaine afterward. Once as Elaine gathered plates, Marla laughed and said to the group, Some people don't belong everywhere they're invited. A few people shifted uncomfortably. No one challenged her. Elaine's hands trembled slightly. She steadied them against the counter. Silence had always been her shield. But shields, she was learning, invited attack when mistaken for surrender. The children noticed before Elaine fully accepted what was happening. One evening, as Elaine tucked her daughter into bed, the girl hesitated, then whispered, Why does Daddy smile more when she's here? The question broke something open in Elaine's chest. She brushed her daughter's hair gently, searching for an answer that wouldn't burden a child. I don't know, she said finally. And for the first time, she admitted to herself how dangerous not knowing had become. Elaine began paying closer attention to how Marla positioned herself between Elaine and Nicholas in rooms, to how Nicholas deferred to Marla's opinions automatically, to how the atmosphere shifted when Marla entered heavier, sharper, colder. And beneath it all, Elaine felt something building, not just disrespect but preparation, as if space was being cleared, as if the house itself were being rearranged for someone else. Elaine stood alone in the living room one night, watching Marla laugh beside Nicholas, watching her red dress glow against the soft holiday lights. Christmas decorations were already up. The tree stood tall in the corner, lights blinking quietly, patient and unaware. Elaine wrapped her arms around herself, a strange calm settling in. Christmas was only days away, and something told her that whatever line still existed in this house, it wouldn't survive the holiday. The slap didn't come out of chaos, it came out of order. The house was full that night. Nicholas's relatives, a few colleagues from the company, the children in new pajamas racing around with toys. Christmas music played low in the background. The smell of roasted food clung to the air. To anyone walking in for the first time, it looked like a normal Christmas Eve. Elaine knew better. She had spent the day moving on autopilot, cooking, tidying, guiding the kids through their excitement, keeping her voice gentle even when her chest felt tight. Nicholas had insisted that some important people from work join them this year. It's good optics, he'd said. We're a family company. It looks stable. He hadn't said for my image, but he didn't need to. Marla arrived early. Red dress, red lipstick. No shame. She greeted Nicholas first, arms looping easily around his neck. Then she turned to Elaine and offered a polite hug that never got close enough to actually touch. Thank you for having us, she said, as if the house weren't already treating her like it recognized her footsteps. Elaine nodded. Of course. The evening slid by in careful slices. Elaine handed out plates, helped the kids set up their toys, smiled for photos she didn't want to be in. She watched quietly as Nicholas hovered near Marla more than he did near his own children. He's under a lot of pressure, a cousin whispered once, trying to be kind. Elaine just nodded. Later in the living room, with wrapping paper scattered on the floor and the children showing their gifts to anyone who would look, Nicholas positioned himself near the tree. Marla stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. This, Nicholas said loudly, gesturing around him, is what pressure looks like. Building something from the ground up, most people can't handle it. He didn't look at Elaine, but his eyes flicked past her. Elaine doesn't really understand business, he added, with a practiced half-laugh. A relative laughed weakly, unsure. Elaine felt several pairs of eyes flick toward her, then away. No one spoke. One of Nicholas's uncles tried to change the subject. Well, whatever you're doing, Nick, it's working. The company's growing. Marla smiled, tilting her head. With the right leadership, she said. You have to make tough calls. Some people hold you back without meaning to. Her gaze slid over to Elaine. Earlier that evening, in the kitchen, a smaller incident had already planted the seed. Nicholas had been telling a detailed story about a large client contract. The numbers he quoted were off. The date he gave for the contract's renewal was wrong off by months. Elaine, who still read every quarterly report the trustee sent, corrected him gently. The renewal was in March, not January, she said. You were in Chicago then, remember? Nicholas flushed, just slightly, in front of the two colleagues listening. Marla had stepped in quickly, hand on his arm. She nitpicks, she said with a soft laugh. It's cute at home, but it makes him look bad in front of people. The word bad had lodged in Nicholas's ego like a splinter. By the time they reached the living room, Marla had leaned into that wound. She keeps undercutting you, she had whispered, in front of your own staff. If you don't stop it now, the board will think you're weak. Nicholas, already raw and proud, believed her. Back in the living room, Elaine stood near the edge of the group, hands loosely clasped, the children moving in and out of her orbit. Marla turned toward her. Well, she said lightly, swirling the wine in her glass, I suppose it's time we stop pretending. Elaine's heart rate ticked up. Pretending about what? She asked quietly, glancing at the children, who were close enough to hear tone if not words. That this, Marla, gestured vaguely in Elaine's direction, is working. A few relatives shifted uneasily. Someone muttered, Hey, maybe not in front of the kids. Nicholas didn't step in. Elaine opened her mouth, not to argue to de-escalate, to move the conversation away from the children. She didn't get the chance. Marla stepped forward. The slap was deliberate, measured, not impulsive. Her eyes were clear. Her arm didn't shake. Her palm met Elaine's cheek with a sharp crack that cut straight through the music and the murmurs. Elaine's head turned with the force of it. Heat exploded across her cheek. The sound echoed off the walls, louder than the carols, louder than the little gasps someone tried and failed to swallow. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. Then the children screamed. One dropped a toy. One ran toward Elaine. Another pressed against the couch, eyes wide. Elaine staggered back, one hand flying to her face, the other reaching blindly toward her children. Her ears rang, her vision blurred at the edges. The taste of metal filled her mouth. A cousin started to step between them. Nicholas lifted a hand slightly, not to shield Elaine, but to stop his cousin. Nick, the cousin began. Nicholas cut him off with a look. Marla didn't look shocked. She didn't look angry either. She looked satisfied. Nick, what are you doing? Someone whispered harshly. Nicholas ignored them. Elaine dropped to her knees, gathering her crying children into her arms, shielding them with her body as if something else might come next. For a heartbeat, she waited. Not for apologies, for instinct, for Nicholas to move, to shout, to put himself between them. He didn't. He took a breath, looked straight at her, and said, his voice flat and clear enough for everyone to hear, You brought this on yourself. Always embarrassing me. Always a burden. The words hit harder than the slap. A burden. Around them, the room froze in a new way. Several people looked down. One aunt fumbled with her phone, filming but half aiming it at the carpet, too afraid to stop what was happening, too ashamed to look directly. No one stepped fully forward, some out of cowardice, some out of shock. Some because Nicholas was their provider now, the successful one, and they didn't want to get involved. Later, Elaine's lawyer would get copies of those shaky videos. But in that moment, all Elaine had was the burning in her cheek and the weight of small bodies clinging to her. That was when something inside her went quiet, not shattered, not broken, sealed. She stood slowly, her movements careful, controlled. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She didn't ask why. She looked at one of Nicholas's aunts, the one whose eyes were already wet with guilt, and said, Steady, can you please help the children upstairs? I need to get their things. The aunt nodded quickly, taking the children's hands, whispering soothing words as they moved toward the staircase. Marla watched Elaine with open triumph now. Nicholas said nothing. Nothing as Elaine walked past him. Nothing as she went up the stairs. Nothing as a door closed gently behind her. Upstairs, Elaine knelt beside small beds, hands shaking only when the children couldn't see her face. She checked their arms, their cheeks, making sure none of them had been hurt in the rush. They clung to her. Are we in trouble? One whispered. No, Elaine said firmly. You are not in trouble. This is not your fault. Downstairs, the murmur of voices rose and fell. A door opened. Closed. Someone left early, muttering about drama. No one called the police. Elaine sat on the floor beside her children until their breathing slowed. That was when she decided she would not raise them in a house where violence was performed and then justified as her fault. When they finally drifted into uneasy sleep, still in their clothes, Elaine stayed awake on the edge of the bed, cheek throbbing, mind suddenly very clear. She would leave. Not with a slammed door. With a plan. Because the woman who lay awake in that house on Christmas Eve was not the woman who would still be living there in the morning. And somewhere on a hard drive in someone's pocket, a shaking video already existed, a record that would later speak for her when other people refused to. Elaine left before the sun came up. Not in tears, not in panic. The decision had been made hours earlier on the edge of that bed, listening to her children whimper in their sleep every time a door creaked downstairs. She moved fast and quiet, heart steady, hands sure. The house was finally silent. Nicholas had gone to the guest room after most guests left, muttering something about needing space. Marla had called a car and slipped out just after midnight, not wanting to be around the children's crying. It was easier to leave when neither of them was watching. Elaine dressed the children gently, whispering that they were going to stay somewhere calmer for a while. They blinked sleepily but didn't argue. The older one looked at her cheek and didn't ask. Shoes, coats, backpacks, important documents she had already gathered in the night, the leather folder, a change of clothes each, medications, birth certificates from the file box she'd memorized the location of years ago. She didn't look at the walls. She didn't look at the photos. She didn't look back. By the time the first light touched the street, the house behind her was already something else, not a home, not a memory, just a structure she no longer needed to explain herself inside. Nicholas didn't call that morning. He slept in. When he finally came downstairs and saw the empty rooms, the absence of small voices, the neatly cleared shoe rack, he stood still for a long time. Then he got angry. And then he performed. He filed. And he made sure everyone knew it. Over the next days, he waved the divorce papers like a prop, telling anyone who would listen that Elaine had finally shown her true colors. He said she was unstable, too emotional, a burden he had carried for years. He hinted that money had gone missing, that she had never understood pressure, that she was a liability. He didn't say he had watched another woman hit her. He didn't say the children were there. People filled in the blanks the way people always do. Marla helped. She moved in fast, too fast for anyone who believed the "we were just colleagues" story. Neighbors saw her through the windows within days, barefoot, comfortable, wearing one of Elaine's old robes like it had always belonged to her. She sat in Elaine's chair at the table. She laughed loudly. She told friends openly, "This is where we'll live now." She didn't say Elaine's name. She didn't have to. Elaine heard all of this secondhand through texts that began with, "I didn't know how to tell you," and ended with, "I'm so sorry." Through pauses in conversations when people realized she wasn't hysterical, she was calm, composed, not begging. They mistook that calm for defeat. Elaine let them. The first meeting happened 2 days later, in a quiet office with frosted glass and no distractions. Janice Thomas, the lawyer, her father had told her to keep in her contacts just in case, was in her late 40s, hair pulled back, eyes sharp but kind. Elaine hadn't needed her in all the years since Aaron's death. Now she did. Janice listened without interrupting. Elaine told the story plainly. The insults, the financial control, the slap, the fact that it had happened in front of their children, the video she'd been sent the next day by Nicholas's guilty aunt. Janice didn't gasp. She didn't dramatize. She nodded slowly, taking notes. "When did the financial changes begin?" she asked. Elaine gave dates. "When did documents start disappearing?" Janice asked. Elaine described the changed passwords and how household statements stopped arriving where they used to. She also mentioned the trustee letters Nicholas had never seen because, from the beginning, she had redirected those to herself. Janice set her pen down. "You did the right thing leaving," she said, "legally and as a mother. Now we document everything." That word document grounded Elaine. Janice explained the next steps carefully. Temporary custody protections, emergency orders, citing the violence in front of the children, financial discovery. And then she asked the question Elaine had been waiting for. "Do you want to understand where the money went?" Elaine nodded once. "Yes." The forensic accountant arrived a week later. Seth Gross, early 40s, quiet, precise, the kind of man who spoke only when necessary. He didn't ask about feelings. He asked for records. Bank statements, credit reports, emails, statements from the trustee where Nicholas had signed off on things he barely read. Elaine provided what she had screenshots she had taken months ago without fully knowing why. Dates she had written down instinctively, transactions that didn't feel right even then. She handed him the leather folder too. Seth studied everything carefully. "This wasn't random," he said finally. "This was intentional." Elaine felt a small shift inside her chest, not relief, not anger. Confirmation. They worked methodically, no rush, no theatrics. They traced transfers that didn't match household expenses, found consulting fees that led straight to accounts controlled by Nicholas and indirectly by Marla. Noticed how access permissions inside the company had changed around the same time Marla started appearing everywhere. Patterns formed. Elaine watched the evidence stack grow, neat and undeniable. She didn't celebrate. She waited. At night, when the children slept on air mattresses in the small apartment she'd rented, Elaine sat alone with her thoughts. She replayed moments she had once brushed aside, the way Nicholas had flinched when she corrected him, the way Marla had spoken with such certainty about internal company decisions she shouldn't have known, the way silence had been used against Elaine as proof she didn't understand. She understood now. Silence was not surrender. Silence was observation, and observation, when paired with truth, became leverage. Elaine never posted online, never defended herself in group chats, never explained. She let Nicholas talk. Every lie was a gift. Weeks began to form a rhythm. School drop-offs, lawyer meetings, emails from the trustee confirming they had received Janice's letters. Quiet evenings with the children where they read instead of tiptoeing around their father's temper. One afternoon, Seth called. "I found something," he said simply. Elaine closed her eyes. "Everything?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Everything." Elaine thanked him and ended the call. She sat very still after that. No shaking, no tears, just clarity. She opened the thin leather folder, the one that had followed her for years, and placed a single new document inside. At the top of the page was a date and a meeting time. Elaine closed the folder carefully, as if sealing something sacred. Because Nicholas Holland still believed he was standing on solid ground. He had no idea that beneath him, every support had already been removed. The floor wouldn't collapse loudly. It would simply refuse to hold him when the moment came. Elaine didn't fall apart. She dismantled. The work began before dawn most days, while the children still slept in the next room of the small apartment she'd rented on a month-to-month lease. Elaine sat at a cheap wooden desk, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back, eyes steady. No dramatic revenge speeches. No obsession with Nicholas's social media. Just structure, just order, just truth. While Nicholas Holland celebrated his freedom, publicly posing with Marla at restaurants, tagging locations, soaking in comments about starting over, Elaine sat across from people who didn't care about feelings. They cared about facts. Her lawyer, Janice, spread documents across a conference table one morning. "Let's start with what we know for sure," Janice said. "Ownership." Elaine slid the thin leather folder across to her. Janice opened it and took her time. Inside were the trust agreements, the sealed custodian instructions, the original share certificates from Dickerson Freight, now operating under its modernized name, DF Logistics still listing the family trust as majority owner. "Your father was careful," Janice said quietly. Elaine nodded. "He knew I might need protection from someone I loved." Janice didn't flinch at that. "With these," Janice said, tapping the documents, "the board answers to the trust. And the trust answers to you. Nicholas is an employee with an executive title, not an owner." Elaine already knew that. Hearing someone else say, it still mattered. Seth, the forensic accountant, took longer. He worked from a separate office across town, sending only short emails for updates. "Need 3 more months of statements. Can you confirm this date? Did you authorize this transfer?" Elaine answered each question precisely. One afternoon, she sat with him in person. The table between them was covered in printed statements, highlighted entries, and spreadsheets. "This is what we've got," Seth said. "Company funds used to pay for flights that coincided with strategy retreats Nicholas took with Marla. Hotel stays coded as client development, luxury purchases marked as entertainment. A consulting entity set up in Marla's name, receiving steady monthly fees from DF Logistics for operational review. then transferring large portions out again within days. Was there any formal contract with her firm approved by the board? Seth asked. No, Elaine said. I'd have seen it in the trustee reports. Then this, Seth said, pointing to the pages, is a problem. For him, not you. He turned his laptop around. Emails appeared on screen, internal messages pulled from Discovery once Janice formally requested access as majority owner's legal representative. Nicholas forwarding internal strategy documents to Marla's personal email. Marla replying with coaching lines. Frame this as a temporary audit process. She won't understand the details. If she gets emotional, use that, say she's overwhelmed. People will believe it. Elaine read them silently. Her eyes didn't water. Her jaw just set a little tighter. Seth clicked to the next file. Internal notes Nicholas had written, assuming only friendly staff would ever see them. Need to push Elaine out of decision-making. She's dead weight. Marla recommends separating finances so she can't interfere. The word dead weight was underlined in one draft. Nicholas had never said that to Elaine in an email. He'd saved it for spoken arguments. He'd kept it for places where he thought there would be no record. He was wrong. Seth sat back. This is enough to demonstrate misuse of company funds and breach of fiduciary duty, he said, especially with his title. Elaine nodded once. Is it enough, she asked, that the board won't just see me as a bitter ex-wife? Yes, Seth said simply, because on paper, you're not just his ex-wife. He tapped the trust agreement. You're their controlling owner. At home, life settled into an odd rhythm. School drop-offs, lawyer meetings, budget grocery trips, cartoons on low volume in the evenings. The children stopped flinching when a man's voice got louder on TV. They started asking simple questions again, like which cereal to buy, instead of serious ones, like whether Daddy is mad. Elaine kept her answers age-appropriate. Daddy and I are making decisions with helpers, she would say. The helpers are making sure everyone is safe. At night, when the children slept, she opened the leather folder. She added new documents beside the old. Judge's temporary order granting her primary care of the kids until the court made a final decision. Confirmation from the trustee recognizing her as instructing party. Email from company counsel acknowledging receipt of Janice's letter requesting an emergency board session. The board had agreed. They wanted to review concerns. They didn't know yet how much Elaine had or how much she was willing to show. One evening, Janice sat back after going through another stack of Seth's summaries. He's exposed, Janice said, professionally and financially. But I need to ask you this. What do you want from the company, specifically? Elaine thought for a moment. I don't need revenge, she said. I need clarity. I want him removed from a position where he can hurt other people with the same carelessness. And personally, Janice asked, I want custody secured, and whatever financial settlement reflects reality, not the story he's been telling. Janice nodded. We'll use the board meeting to address him as an executive, she said. The divorce court will see him as a husband and father. Our job is to make sure those two pictures match. Elaine exhaled slowly. That's what she had been doing all along. Matching pictures, lining up actions and consequences, turning silence into a record. The call came on a rainy Thursday. Seth's voice was calm. I've finished the reconstruction, he said. Every dollar that left the company without approval. Every payment to Marla's shell consultancy. Every personal expense disguised as business. It's all in the report the board will see. Elaine closed her eyes. Thank you, she said. After they hung up, she sat very still. Then she opened the leather folder. Tucked behind the trust documents was a new paper one Janice had drafted and she had signed 2 days earlier. A formal motion, as majority owner, to convene an executive review of Chief Operations Officer Nicholas Holland for breach of fiduciary duty. At the top were the date and time the board had agreed to meet. Elaine slid the motion to the front of the folder. Nicholas still thought the upcoming meeting was his moment to pitch expansion. He didn't know the agenda had changed. The company he bragged about like a trophy was about to show him whose name was actually carved into its foundation. And for the first time in years, Elaine felt something close to anticipation, not of his downfall, of finally stepping into the room that had always, quietly, been hers. Nicholas Holland woke up that morning convinced he had survived the worst of it. The house felt different, but in a way he liked quiet, controlled, stripped of drama. Elaine's presence no longer hung over every argument. The kid's absence, he told himself, was temporary. Court stuff. Nothing more. He stood in front of the mirror, straightening his tie, studying the man staring back at him. The faint lines around his eyes looked less like stress and more like experience, he decided. He had stories now. He'd spun them well. He had told anyone who would listen that Elaine had walked out irrationally, that she had never understood the pressure he was under, that she had tried to interfere with his company. He hinted that she had mental health issues, that she had become paranoid. He left out the parts about the slap. He left out the video. People believed the version they found easier to sit with. In the kitchen, Marla moved with the comfort of someone who had never paid for the space she occupied. She wore tailored pants and one of Elaine's old silk blouses, claimed, washed, and folded into her own drawers. She poured coffee into Elaine's mug without hesitation. "After today," Marla said, sliding the mug toward him with a smile, "this is all going to be behind us. Once the board hears your expansion plan, they'll know you're the future of DF Logistics." Nicholas liked the way she said "you're." He picked up his folder, thick with charts, projections, buzzwords he'd practiced until they sounded like strategy. "Executive review is just a formality," Marla added, smoothing his lapel. "Someone probably complained about the restructuring, but the board needs you. I'll sit in, back you up if needed." He nodded. He liked thinking of the meeting that way. Formalities, approvals, recognition, visibility equaled ownership. It always had, in his mind. The drive to the office felt ordinary. Traffic lights, buses, pedestrians, all moving through their own lives. Nicholas stayed on his phone almost the entire time, skimming congratulatory messages from friends and acquaintances who were still repeating his fresh start narrative. A notification from his lawyer sat unread. A message thread with Elaine's name had been silent for days. He scrolled past it. At the building entrance, Nicholas stepped through security with practiced ease. The guard nodded. The receptionist offered a neutral, "Good morning." Nothing felt off yet. He swiped his access card at the turnstile. The light flashed red. He frowned, swiped again, slower. Red. "Is there a glitch?" he asked, trying to laugh it off. The security guard checked the screen. "Your access level was adjusted overnight," he said. "You're still cleared to enter the building, but not executive floors without approval." Nicholas blinked. "Adjusted by who?" he demanded. "Corporate Security Administration," the guard said. "Probably tied to the executive review meeting." Marla stepped in smoothly. "This is ridiculous," she said with a short laugh. "We're literally going to the review that decides that access. Can you buzz us through? We're on the agenda." The guard hesitated, then picked up the phone. "Let me confirm," he said. Nicholas forced a smile, as if this were mildly annoying but beneath his concern. But he felt it a small crack, opening. At the elevator, his assistant greeted him on the executive floor with an expression that was too carefully neutral. "Conference room?" he asked, adjusting his tie. "The board requested the main boardroom," she said. "Access is restricted today." "Restricted how?" Marla cut in, heels clicking too loudly in the quiet hallway. The assistant swallowed. "Only board members and individuals listed on the amended agenda," she said. "I sent you the update, Mr. Holland." Nicholas pulled out his phone, opened his calendar. The meeting title was no longer Expansion Strategy. It read, Executive Review, COO Conduct and Governance. He hadn't noticed the subject change the night before. His jaw tightened. "Who amended it?" he asked. "I only see the instruction from corporate counsel," his assistant said, "and a note that the trust representative will be present." Nicholas frowned. "Which trust?" She looked at him, genuinely surprised. "The majority owner trust," she said. "The one that's always been on the cap table?" Marla's hand on his arm stiffened. Nicholas waved it off. "It's procedural," he said, more to himself than anyone. "They want their boxes ticked." He walked toward the boardroom. The door was closed. Through the glass, he could see board members filtering in, taking their seats. No one waved him in. No one signaled. His nameplate was still in front of an empty chair near the middle of the table, not at the head. He told himself that didn't matter. He reached for the handle. A security guard stepped smoothly into his path. "I'm sorry, Mr. Holland," the guard said quietly. "The instructions say to wait outside until you're called." Nicholas stared at him. Called by who? He asked. The guard glanced at the tablet in his hand. Trust representative, he said. Or the board chair. Trust representative. Nicholas's chest tightened. For the first time, the word ownership flickered in his mind, not as something he had, but as something he might not. Behind him, Marla's phone buzzed. She checked the screen quickly. Her eyes narrowed, but this time, not in confidence. In caution. Inside the boardroom, the clock ticked to the hour. The meeting began. Without him. The hallway outside the boardroom had never felt long before. Today, it did. Nicholas stayed near the glass, pretending to scroll his phone, pretending not to care that he was the only executive still standing in the hallway instead of sitting at the table. He'd been on the other side of that glass so many times, striding in, cracking jokes, commanding the room with easy charm. Now he watched someone else take that walk. The door opened. The boardroom fell quiet. Elaine Connor stepped inside. Not as a guest, not as a spouse, not as an afterthought. She wore a tailored suit in a neutral shade, the kind that didn't ask for attention but naturally received it. Her hair was pulled back neatly. In her hand, as always, was the thin leather folder Nicholas had never bothered to ask much about. This time, the board members noticed it. She didn't glance toward the glass immediately. She walked straight to the head of the table, where the board chair usually sat. Today, the chair was angled slightly to the side, making room. The chair remained in the room. Nicholas did not. Elaine placed the folder on the polished wood, opened it calmly, and took a seat at the end of the table in the space reserved for the representative of the majority owner. No one questioned her. Corporate counsel simply nodded, as if they had been expecting her all along. Only then did she lift her gaze toward the hallway. For a brief moment, her eyes met Nicholas's through the glass. There was no gloating in them, no visible hatred, just distance, clarity, recognition not of who he was, but of where he no longer stood. Then she turned away. "Let's begin," the board chair said. The door closed. The sound was soft, final. Nicholas stared at his own faint reflection in the glass and at the silhouettes behind it. He saw documents being passed, a projection screen lighting up, faces leaning forward with focus. He couldn't hear the words, but he recognized the rhythm. He'd sat through enough reviews to know the difference between a casual briefing and a serious inquiry. This was the latter. Beside him, Marla's posture had changed. She was no longer standing like a partner. She had shifted, ever so slightly, closer to the exit. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced down, eyes scanning a short message quickly. Her face went pale. "What?" Nicholas snapped. She didn't answer. Inside, Elaine stood. Graphs appeared behind her, clean, simple visuals. Seth's work. From where he stood, Nicholas could see lines trending in directions he didn't like. One bar labeled Authorized Company Expenses ended far lower than another labeled Actual Outgoing Payments. His name appeared beneath several of the bars. So did Marla's. Nicholas pressed closer to the glass. He almost didn't hear the security guard approach. "I need you to step back from the door, sir," the guard said. Nicholas didn't move. "That's my meeting," he said through his teeth. The guard checked the tablet again. "According to this," he said, "it's the trust's meeting. You'll be invited in if and when they request your presence." If and when. Nicholas turned back toward the glass. Inside, Elaine pointed to a section of the screen. A board member asked a question. Elaine replied, turning a page in her folder, handing something to the board chair. Nicholas caught a glimpse of a still frame on the next slide. A frozen image of his own living room, Christmas lights in the background, wrapping paper on the floor, Marla's arm in mid-motion. His own face, visible and passive in the corner of the frame. His stomach dropped. He hadn't known the video existed. He hadn't known Elaine had it. Marla took a step away from him. "Where are you going?" he hissed. She gave a tight, brittle smile. "I need to make a call," she said. "My firm." "You don't have a firm," he snapped. She didn't deny it. She just kept walking. For the first time since she'd entered his life in that red dress, Marla moved in the opposite direction of whichever way Nicholas was looking. Inside, another slide flicked onto the screen. This time, he could read the title clearly through the glass. Executive Summary of Misuse of Company Funds, N. Holland, M. Gray. The board chair's expression hardened. Elaine didn't look toward the glass again. She was no longer reacting to Nicholas. She was addressing the people who actually controlled his professional fate. People who now understood that the quiet woman he dismissed as a burden had been the majority owner's voice all along. Nicholas felt something he hadn't allowed himself in years. Not anger, not indignation, fear, not of losing money, of losing the story he'd built about who he was. And for the first time, he understood what the red light on the badge reader that morning had really meant. He wasn't just temporarily locked out. He had already been removed from the room where decisions were made. He just hadn't realized it until now. The boardroom settled into that particular kind of quiet that felt almost heavy. Elaine stood at the end of the table, the leather folder open, pages lined up in a neat, deliberate order. "Thank you," she said, "for allowing me to present in my capacity as representative of the majority owner trust." A small, simple sentence. It rewrote years of assumption in a single breath. Some board members already knew the structure in theory. None of them had ever seen her exercise it like this. Elaine began with the trust itself. She explained clearly, without embellishment, how Aaron Dickerson had transferred controlling shares of Dickerson Freight, now DF Logistics, into the family trust. How the trust's voting rights had always been tied to detailed instructions she had signed. How, when Nicholas was hired, he had been brought in as an employee with a generous compensation package, but no equity ownership beyond a small performance-based grant. Confirmation documents appeared on the screen. Signatures, dates, the original trust deed, amendments that clarified her role after her father died. Company counsel verified each one aloud. For the record. Next came Seth's findings. Elaine didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She walked through the numbers, line by line. "Here are legitimate business expenses," she said, indicating one column. "And here is a pattern of charges that cannot be justified by company policy or board-approved executive perks. Trips with no client meetings attached. Restaurant bills in cities where no vendor or customer logged visits. Payments marked for consulting to an entity that had never been presented to the board for approval. As of the end of last quarter," Elaine continued, "these unauthorized expenditures total this amount." The figure on the screen made two board members whistle under their breath. One cleared his throat, embarrassed. Corporate counsel looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. Elaine clicked to the next slide. "So far, these charges point to poor judgment and breach of company policy," she said. "What elevates this to breach of fiduciary duty is what came next." Emails appeared. Nicholas forwarding Marla internal financial spreadsheets. Marla advising him on how to hide certain expenses within larger budget categories. Call it audit variance. No one reads the breakdowns. If she pushes, say she's overwhelmed, and you're handling the hard stuff. One board member shifted in his chair. "She in these messages refers to you?" he asked. Elaine shook her head. In Nicholas's mind, yes, she said. In legal reality, it refers to the trust. To the controlling owner he thought could be talked around with emotion. She let that sit. Then she clicked to the video still. "This," she said, voice still calm, "is not a company expense. But it is relevant to character and to the integrity expected from an executive responsible for our people and our reputation." A staffer dimmed the lights as the short video played. The room watched, in silence, as Nicholas's living room appeared. Christmas lights, children, Marla in red, the slap, Elaine going to her knees. Nicholas standing still. Someone muttered, "My God." A board member's jaw tightened. Another closed his eyes briefly. Elaine spoke only once the screen went dark. "I did not bring this to criminal court," she said. "Yet, but I am not prepared to allow a man who condones violence against the mother of his children in front of them to continue representing this company as one of its public faces." No one argued. Through the glass, Nicholas couldn't hear the words. He didn't need to. He saw enough. He watched his own behavior, stripped of justification, played back without his commentary. He watched faces change when they saw him not as the storyteller, but as the subject. Earlier in the week, the board had questioned Nicholas privately, with counsel present. He'd been given the chance to explain the transfers, the invoices, the trips. He'd offered little beyond vague mentions of pressure and complaints about being misunderstood. No one in the room felt they needed to hear the same excuses again. When it was time to vote, the board chair's voice was formal. "The motion on the table," he said, "is immediate termination of Nicholas Holland from his position as Chief Operations Officer for breach of fiduciary duty." gross misuse of company funds, and conduct detrimental to the company's reputation, restitution, and legal recourse to follow the recommendations of counsel. Hands went up around the table. No one abstained. No one asked for more time. Elaine didn't smile. She simply closed the folder. Corporate counsel slid a prepared packet toward the chair. "We've drafted the initial termination documents," counsel said. "The trust sign-off is already included." Elaine picked up the pen, signed. For years she had watched Nicholas sign things he didn't bother to read. Now he would feel what it was like to have his future altered by a signature he didn't see coming. Later that day, in a smaller room, a quiet press briefing took place, not a spectacle, just a controlled release. Elaine stood at a podium, a plain backdrop behind her with the DF Logistics logo. She didn't attack Nicholas by name. The lawyers had made sure of that. But she didn't hide behind vague language either. "Our company has completed a thorough internal review," she said. "We found serious misuse of company funds and conduct inconsistent with our values from a senior executive. That executive is no longer with us. We are cooperating fully with any further review and have initiated steps to make the company whole." Questions came. Was this related to her personal life? Was she the same Elaine mentioned in rumors tied to a viral video? She kept her answers clean. "My personal life has been in legal proceedings," she said. "I will say only this: I left a situation that was not safe for my children. The internal review process looked at documented facts, not gossip. The company will not be run on anyone's narrative except the truth." When asked about her role, she did not downplay it. "I represent the controlling interest," she said. "I chose to be quiet for a long time because I thought stability required it. I was wrong. Stability requires accountability." She stepped away from the podium as calmly as she had approached it. No dramatic walk-off, just completion. The divorce finalized weeks later. Custody went to Elaine with clear, written conditions about Nicholas's access: supervised visits, adherence to a therapist-approved plan, zero tolerance for any form of intimidation. The judge had seen the same video the board had. Nicholas tried to call. Once. Then again. Voicemails piled up: apologies, reinterpretations, pleas, blame. "I was under pressure. She manipulated me. You've always known I lean on people too hard." Elaine saved one of the messages for her legal file. She didn't respond to any. Silence, finally, was no longer her shield. It was her boundary. Marla left Nicholas the same way she had entered Elaine's life. Quietly, quickly, without loyalty. There was no dramatic fight, no long letter about how he'd failed her. One morning, Nicholas woke to a house that felt wrong again, not because it was full of tension, but because it was empty in the wrong places. Her side of the bed was bare. Her toiletries gone from the bathroom. The closet space she'd claimed was half empty, hangers swinging slightly. On the kitchen counter, beside the half-emptied coffee bag, sat a short note. "I can't be tied to this. I have to think of my career." No signature, no apology. The consulting entity in her name was already in the process of being shut down under legal pressure. The board's lawyers had included her in their findings. Other companies she'd hoped to impress quietly cut off contact. Status had evaporated. So had she. Nicholas stared at the note, then at the walls. He checked his email. "Your severance is under review, pending restitution. Your access to the company portal has been permanently revoked. Please direct all further communication through your legal caption, representative." The word pending followed him everywhere now. Pending settlement. Pending payment plans. Pending decisions about what kind of supervised access he would have to the children whose Christmas he had shattered. The house, once a stage for his stories, had become an echo chamber. His own voice was the only one left in it. Across town, Elaine woke up to a different kind of quiet, the kind that didn't make her brace. Light filtered through the windows of her new living room, smaller than the old one, but fully hers. The children sat cross-legged on the rug, arguing in that harmless way siblings do about which ornaments should go where on the tree they were decorating. Their laughter was unguarded. It sounded like it had when they were younger, before they learned to scan their father's face for mood changes. Elaine leaned in the doorway, a warm mug in her hands, listening. This was what remained. Not the house, not the car, not the image Nicholas had tried to curate. Her children, her clarity, her name on the documents that actually mattered. At work, the company settled into its new shape. Elaine didn't suddenly start showing up in every internal memo. That wasn't who she was. She installed a professional CEO with a clean record and a steady temperament. She remained as chair of the board and trust representative, approving clear policies about executive expenses and conflict of interest disclosures. Staff who had once looked away in hallways now sent short messages. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything earlier. I should have believed the way you looked that night. Thank you for cleaning this up the right way." Elaine read them all. She replied to some with a simple, "Thank you. Let's do better going forward." She didn't waste energy punishing them for the fear that had kept them still. Their work now would say more than any apology. At home, the kids slept through the night more often than not. They still went to therapy. So did Elaine. Healing was not a switch, but slowly the house stopped carrying the weight of what had happened in the old one. One evening, as Elaine tucked them in, her daughter looked at her seriously. "Mom," she said softly, "you're not quiet like before." Elaine smiled. "I'm still quiet," she said, "just not invisible." On the next weekend, they unpacked a box labeled Christmas. Elaine hadn't realized she'd brought the simple glass ornament from the old house until she unwrapped it. She turned it in her hand. It caught the light and scattered it across the wall. Last year, that ornament had hung in a room where violence was excused and children were told not to make things worse. This year, it would hang in a place where no raised hand would ever be tolerated. She handed it to her son. "Where should this one go?" she asked. He pointed to a branch at the center of the tree. "Right there," he said, "so we can all see it." She nodded. He hung it carefully. The anniversary of that Christmas Eve came and went without fanfare. Elaine didn't mark the date on a calendar, but her body remembered. That morning, she stood in the living room for a moment, watching the tree glow softly. No shouting, no slammed doors, no careful calculation about who was in which mood. Just the rustle of wrapping paper, the smell of something baking in the oven, and the sound of her children bickering lightly over whose turn it was to open the next gift. She thought of the woman she had been, a woman who let others take credit, who believed silence could save love, who protected a man who would not lift a hand to protect her. That woman hadn't been foolish. She had been trusting. She had been learning. Now she was something else. Boundaried, steady, visible. Elaine turned off the overhead lights so only the tree lit the room. She didn't think about whether Nicholas was lonely in his larger, quieter house. She didn't waste energy wondering if Marla regretted anything. Those stories were no longer hers to track. What mattered was this: her children, asleep in rooms without fear. Her company, guided by people who understood that responsibility is not about volume. Her own reflection, which she could finally look at without wondering if she'd failed by staying too long or leaving too early. Silence, she knew now, could be surrender. But it could also be strategy, and once dignity was reclaimed, it didn't ask for anyone's permission to exist. Elaine picked up her mug, listened to her children's voices drifting from down the hall, and smiled. The past had finally stopped banging on the door. The future no longer needed to knock. I hope you enjoyed watching this story as much as I enjoyed creating it. If it moved you, like, share, and comment on the lessons you took from it. Let me know where you're watching from, and I'll see you in the next video.
After her dad, who was a secret trillionaire, died, her husband divorced his crippled wife to marry her best friend, unaware of her $1 trillion inheritance. But what she did when his mother begged would shock him in ways no amount of money could prepare him for. The wheelchair-bound woman sat in the sterile conference room of Harrison and Associates, her trembling hands gripping legal documents that revealed her father's hidden empire, an empire built across 5 continents that nobody, not her husband of 7 years, not her childhood best friend, not even her late mother, had known existed. The divorce papers her husband had served her 3 days after her father's funeral were still crisp in her purse, the ink barely dry on documents that dissolved their marriage so he could wed the woman who had held her hand through chemotherapy, through surgeries, through every agonizing moment when the car accident had stolen her ability to walk. The attorney's words echoed in her consciousness as he explained the staggering sum. Not millions, not hundreds of millions, but a fortune so vast it could fund small nations, while somewhere across town her ex-husband was planning his engagement party, completely oblivious that the woman he'd abandoned for being a burden now controlled more wealth than he could fathom in 10 lifetimes. 6 months would pass before his mother would arrive at the marble steps of the mansion her daughter-in-law now owned, tears streaming down her weathered face as she clutched photos of grandchildren she'd never meet, begging for a mercy she had never shown. But would the crippled heiress extend forgiveness to the family that had discarded her like yesterday's newspaper, or would her response reveal a side of her that nobody had seen coming? The fluorescent lights of Roosevelt Memorial Hospital had hummed their cold symphony for 72 hours straight, but Olivia Matthews had stopped counting the minutes somewhere between her father's final labored breath and the moment the heart monitor flatlined into that terrible, endless tone. Her fingers, still strong despite the paralysis that claimed her legs, had gripped Richard Matthews' weathered hand until the warmth left it completely, until the nurses gently pried her away with practiced sympathy in their eyes. Her husband, Derek Collins, had stood by the door during those final moments, his phone screen illuminating his face in the dim room, his attention clearly divided between the dying man before him and whatever messages demanded his focus. Olivia had noticed but said nothing, her grief too raw and overwhelming to process the smaller betrayals happening in real time. The funeral 3 days later was a modest affair at Greenwood Cemetery, attended by perhaps 40 people who had known Richard Matthews as a quiet accountant who lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, drove a 15-year-old sedan, and never spoke about his past. The rain fell in sheets as the casket lowered into the earth, and Olivia sat in her wheelchair, beneath a black umbrella held by Jennifer Morrison, her best friend since elementary school, the woman who had brought her soup when she was sick and helped her relearn basic tasks after the accident 2 years ago that had changed everything. Derek stood apart from them, his expensive suit somehow looking wrong in the gray afternoon light, his eyes flickering to his watch with increasing frequency. What Olivia couldn't have known, what nobody attending that funeral could have possibly suspected, was that Richard Matthews had lived a double life so elaborate, so carefully constructed, that even the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit would later marvel at its complexity. The modest accountant facade had been exactly that, a facade hiding a financial empire that spanned manufacturing plants in Southeast Asia, pharmaceutical patents worth billions, commercial real estate holdings in every major city across North America, and technology investments that had multiplied exponentially over 3 decades. The secret had died with him, but the wealth had not. That evening, as mourners dispersed and Olivia returned to the small apartment she shared with Derek, she found him packing a suitcase. The bedroom they'd shared for 7 years suddenly felt like foreign territory as she wheeled herself through the doorway, her heart beginning to race with an anxiety she couldn't quite name. "We need to talk," Derek said without looking at her, his voice carrying that careful flatness that people use when they've rehearsed difficult conversations in their minds until the words lose all genuine emotion. Olivia's hands gripped the wheels of her chair, her knuckles whitening as something ancient and instinctive whispered warnings her conscious mind wasn't ready to hear. "I've been thinking about this for months," Derek continued, folding a shirt with mechanical precision, still refusing to meet her eyes. "This isn't working anymore. I'm 34 years old, Olivia. I can't spend the rest of my life as a caretaker. I need a partner, not a patient." The words landed like physical blows, each syllable a small violence. "I've filed for divorce," he said, finally turning to face her, his expression carved from stone. "The papers are on the kitchen table. I've already signed them. I'm moving out tonight." Olivia's voice, when it came, sounded small and distant even to her own ears. "There's someone else?" It wasn't a question, but Derek answered anyway. And the truth was somehow worse than any scenario her imagination had constructed during sleepless nights, when she'd sensed his growing distance. Jennifer and I have been seeing each other for 6 months, he said, and the casualness with which he destroyed 2 relationships simultaneously would have been impressive if it weren't so devastating. She understands what I need. She can give me the life I want, the active life, the normal life. We're getting married next month. Jennifer. Her Jennifer. The woman who had braided her hair in 3rd grade, who had been her maid of honor, who had cried with her in the hospital after the accident, promising that nothing would change, that they'd face everything together. That Jennifer. Olivia sat frozen in her wheelchair as Derek finished packing, as he walked out of their apartment carrying 2 suitcases and 7 years of shared history, as the door clicked shut with a finality that echoed in the sudden silence. She didn't cry, not yet. The tears would come later, in the dark hours before dawn, when the full weight of her isolation crashed over her like a tidal wave. But in that moment she simply sat in the lengthening shadows, wondering how she had failed to see the betrayal blooming right in front of her. The envelope from Harrison and Associates arrived 4 days later, delivered by courier to the apartment that now felt too large and too empty, despite being exactly the same size it had always been. Olivia almost didn't open it, assuming it was another legal document related to her father's modest estate, another administrative detail to be handled in the aftermath of death. But something about the weight of the envelope, the quality of the paper, suggested this was different. Inside, a simple letter requested her presence at their downtown offices for a matter of significant importance regarding the estate of Richard James Matthews. The appointment was scheduled for 2 days later at 10 a.m., and a phone number was provided should she need to reschedule. Olivia called a medical transport service to take her to the address, a gleaming high-rise in the financial district that seemed at odds with her father's humble lifestyle. But she went anyway, curious despite herself. The law offices of Harrison and Associates occupied the entire 32nd floor, all marble surfaces and floor-to-ceiling windows, offering panoramic views of the city skyline. A receptionist with a kind smile escorted Olivia to a conference room where 3 attorneys waited, along with a man who introduced himself as Charles Wu, executor of her father's estate. "Ms. Matthews," Charles began, his voice gentle but professional. "What I'm about to tell you will likely come as a shock, but I want to assure you that everything has been verified, notarized, and is completely legal and legitimate." He slid a folder across the polished table toward her, but the papers inside might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the sense they initially made. Numbers. So many numbers. Commas and zeros stretching across pages in configurations that Olivia's brain struggled to process. "Your father," Charles continued, "was not an accountant in the traditional sense you understood. He was, in fact, one of the most successful private investors and entrepreneurs of his generation, operating under various corporate structures and shell companies to maintain his privacy. His net worth at the time of his death was approximately $1.2 trillion. The room tilted slightly, or perhaps that was just Olivia's perception of reality fundamentally shifting. "Trillion," she whispered, testing the word on her tongue. "That's not... People don't have $1 trillion. "Very few do," Charles agreed. "Your father was exceptionally private about his wealth, according to the letters he left for you, and yes, there are several. He wanted to live a normal life, to raise you without the complications that extreme wealth brings. He wanted you to develop your own character, your own values, without the corrupting influence of knowing you'd never have to work, never have to struggle, never have to learn empathy through genuine hardship." One of the attorneys opened another folder, revealing photographs. Her father shaking hands with world leaders, cutting ribbons at factory openings, sitting at boardroom tables surrounded by executives in cities Olivia had only seen in movies. A stranger's life. A stranger who had made her peanut butter sandwiches and helped with homework and taught her to ride a bike. The entirety of his estate passes to you, Charles continued. There are no other beneficiaries. You are now effectively one of the wealthiest individuals in the world. The transition of assets will take some time to complete, but I can arrange for immediate liquidity of several $100 million if you require funds while the larger estate settles. Olivia's mind went immediately to Derek, to the divorce papers she'd signed in numb shock 3 days ago, papers that were being processed by the court even now, but which hadn't yet been finalized. She thought of Jennifer, probably selecting wedding invitations at this very moment, imagining a future built on the rubble of destroyed trust. Neither of them knew. Neither of them had any idea. How long, Olivia asked, her voice steadier than she felt, before the divorce is final? Charles consulted his notes. Based on the filing date and the standard processing time in this jurisdiction, approximately 3 weeks. And they can't contest it? Can't claim any portion of this inheritance? Your father's wealth was entirely separate from any marital assets, one of the attorneys interjected. Your husband has no legal claim to this inheritance whatsoever, particularly given the timing. The divorce was initiated before you had knowledge of the estate's value, which protects you from any claims of concealment. Additionally, your father's will includes specific language protecting his assets from any claims by spouses or former spouses of his heirs. Richard Matthews, it seemed, had thought of everything, had built protections around his daughter even from beyond the grave, though he couldn't have known specifically that she would need them. Over the following weeks, Olivia's life transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible from the perspective of the woman who'd sat in that hospital room watching her father die. She moved from the cramped apartment to a penthouse overlooking Central Park, purchased outright for $45 million without blinking. She hired a team of physical therapists who worked with her 6 hours a day, exploring every possible avenue for improving her mobility and independence. She established a foundation in her father's name, dedicating $1 billion to spinal injury research and accessibility infrastructure. But she did it quietly, through lawyers and intermediaries, maintaining the privacy her father had valued. Most importantly, she said nothing to Derek or Jennifer about her changed circumstances. The silence was strategic, deliberate, and deeply satisfying in ways that surprised her. She watched from a distance as they announced their engagement on social media, as Jennifer posted photos of her ring with captions about finding true love and second chances. She observed as Derek changed his relationship status and wrote saccharine posts about meeting his soulmate. The temptation to reveal the truth was overwhelming at times, but Olivia resisted, understanding that timing would be everything, that the sweetness of eventual revelation would be directly proportional to how long she waited. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in October, processed through the court system with bureaucratic efficiency. Derek received nothing because there was nothing to receive, or so he believed. The modest apartment was sold, the furniture divided, the bank account that had held perhaps $8,000 split down the middle. He signed the papers without hesitation, clearly eager to close this chapter of his life and begin the new one with Jennifer. Olivia received her copy of the final decree while sitting in her penthouse, a glass of wine in her hand, the city lights twinkling below like earthbound stars. She should have felt sad, she supposed, but instead felt only a strange sense of liberation, of a weight lifting that she hadn't fully recognized she was carrying. Derek and Jennifer married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at a boutique venue in the wine country, the kind of tasteful affair that cost perhaps $30,000 and felt lavish to people who didn't understand what true wealth could buy. Olivia knew this because Jennifer's mother, who apparently felt no shame about her daughter's role in destroying a 7-year marriage, posted photos on Facebook with hashtags about love and destiny. The irony was almost too perfect. For 6 months, Olivia lived her new life in quiet contentment, building a routine that included her therapy sessions, her foundation work, and occasionally venturing out to art galleries and restaurants using the freedom that unlimited resources provided. She commissioned modifications to a luxury vehicle that made it fully accessible, hired a driver who treated her chair with the respect it deserved rather than the pity she'd grown accustomed to, and slowly began to rediscover who she was beyond the labels of invalid or victim or abandoned wife. She was having lunch at an upscale bistro in Tribeca on a mild April afternoon when she saw Derek for the first time since the divorce was finalized. He was with Jennifer, and even from across the restaurant, Olivia could see the tension in their body language, the way Jennifer's smile seemed forced, the way Derek's eyes kept darting to his phone with that same distracted energy she remembered from their marriage. They didn't notice her. Why would they? She was just another woman in a wheelchair, easily overlooked in the invisible way that disabled people often are, rendered functionally invisible by society's discomfort with physical difference. But Olivia noticed everything. The way Jennifer's designer handbag was a knockoff, the way Derek's suit was showing wear at the cuffs, the way they both looked somehow diminished, as though the life they'd built on betrayal had extracted a price they hadn't anticipated paying. She felt nothing, not anger, not satisfaction, not even pity, just a distant clinical observation of two people who had made choices and were living with the consequences. The knock on her penthouse door came on a Saturday morning in late April, unexpected and jarring in the quiet of her routine. Olivia checked the security camera feed, her heart rate accelerating when she recognized the woman standing in the hallway, clutching a worn purse and looking somehow smaller than Olivia remembered. Patricia Collins, Derek's mother. Olivia buzzed her up without speaking, curiosity overriding caution. Patricia had aged in the 6 months since Olivia had last seen her, new lines carved around her eyes and mouth, her hair grayer, her shoulders rounded with a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. She stepped into the penthouse and stopped short, her eyes widening as she took in the soaring ceilings, the original artwork on the walls, the view that cost more per month than most people earned in a year. "Olivia," she began, her voice breaking slightly. I didn't know where else to go." They sat in the living room, Patricia perched nervously on the edge of a sofa that had cost more than her car, while Olivia positioned her wheelchair across from her, waiting with the patience that wealth and power had taught her. "Derek is in trouble," Patricia said finally, the words tumbling out in a rush. "He lost his job 3 months ago. He was fired for an incident with a coworker. Sexual harassment allegations. It's all over his industry. No one will hire him." Olivia's expression remained neutral, but internally she noted the information with clinical precision. "Jennifer left him 2 weeks ago," Patricia continued, tears beginning to track down her weathered cheeks. "She said she couldn't handle being married to a failure. She took half of everything they had, which wasn't much to begin with, and moved back in with her parents. The symmetry was almost poetic. "He's living with me now," Patricia said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "In my 2-bedroom apartment. He's depressed, barely eating. He talks about you sometimes, about how he made a mistake, how he threw away something real for something shiny and new." "And you're here because?" Olivia prompted, her tone carefully neutral. Patricia pulled photographs from her purse, spreading them on the coffee table between them. Pictures of Derek as a child, as a teenager, at his college graduation. Pictures of Olivia and Derek on their wedding day, both of them young and hopeful, and completely unprepared for what life would bring. "I'm here to beg," Patricia said simply, her dignity crumbling. "I know I have no right. I know that I stood by while my son abandoned you when you needed him most. I know that I said terrible things about you being a burden, that I encouraged him to leave, that I told him he deserved better than being tied to a wheelchair for the rest of his life." Each confession was a small knife, quick and sharp, But he's my son, Patricia continued, the tears flowing freely now. And he's broken, and I hoped that maybe you would be willing to help him, maybe give him a loan to get back on his feet, or use your connections to help him find work. I know you have money now, the penthouse, the car service, the way you look. Something changed after your father died. There it was. The ask, the presumption that because Olivia had been kind once, had been forgiving once, had loved Derek once, that she would be those things again. Olivia let the silence stretch, watching Patricia shift uncomfortably, watching hope and desperation war across her features. You're right, Olivia said finally. Something did change after my father died. I inherited his estate, all of it, every single dollar of his $1.2 trillion fortune. Patricia's face went blank, her brain visibly struggling to process the number. Trillion, Olivia repeated, with a T. I am one of the wealthiest people on earth, Patricia. I could buy Derek's entire industry without noticing the expense. I could make him successful beyond his wildest dreams with a single phone call. I could solve every problem he has and 1,000 more he hasn't even imagined yet. Hope bloomed in Patricia's eyes, bright and desperate and doomed. But I won't, Olivia continued, her voice calm and implacable. Not a single penny, not now, not ever. But your son divorced me 3 days after my father's funeral, Olivia said, each word measured and deliberate. 3 days. While I was grieving the loss of the only family I had left, while I was trying to process my father's death, he was planning his exit strategy. He served me divorce papers because I was a burden, because my disability made me less than human in his eyes, less deserving of love and partnership. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but Olivia raised a hand, silencing her. Jennifer, my best friend since childhood, the woman I trusted with my deepest secrets and darkest fears, was sleeping with my husband for months before he left. They built their relationship on lies and betrayal, while pretending to care about me, while holding my hand and telling me everything would be okay. They made a mistake, Patricia tried. They made a choice, Olivia corrected sharply. They chose to value convenience and physical ability over loyalty and love. They chose to abandon me when I was most vulnerable, when I needed support more than I ever had in my life. Those weren't mistakes, Patricia. Those were deliberate, calculated decisions that revealed exactly who they are as people. The older woman was crying openly now, but Olivia felt no sympathy, only a cool clarity that came from having months to process her pain, to transform her grief into something harder and more durable. And you, Olivia continued, her gaze sharp and unwavering, you encouraged him every step of the way. You told him he deserved better than a crippled wife. You said I was dragging him down, limiting his potential, trapping him in a life of servitude. Don't think I didn't hear those conversations, Patricia. Don't think I don't remember every single word you said when you thought I couldn't hear. I was wrong, Patricia whispered. I was so wrong. I'm sorry. I'm sure you are, Olivia said. Sorry that your son's choices led to consequences. Sorry that Jennifer turned out to be exactly as shallow as she showed herself to be. Sorry that Derek is now experiencing a fraction of the isolation and rejection that I felt when he abandoned me. But you're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry that it didn't work out the way you planned. Olivia wheeled closer, her eyes locked on Patricia's tear-stained face. Here's what's going to happen, she said quietly. You're going to leave my home and never contact me again. You're going to tell Derek exactly what I said here today, every word. You're going to let him know that I'm aware of his circumstances, that I have the power to change them with a snap of my fingers, and that I'm choosing not to because he earned this outcome through his own actions. Please, no, Olivia said firmly. No please, no bargaining, no second chances. Derek taught me that when people become inconvenient, when they require more effort than they're worth, you cut them loose without looking back. I'm simply applying the lesson he taught me. But even as she spoke these words, Even as she watched Patricia crumble under the weight of rejection, Olivia felt something shift inside her, some final piece of healing clicking into place. The anger she'd carried for months, the hurt that had burrowed deep into her bones, was finally beginning to release its grip. Not because Derek or Jennifer or Patricia deserved her forgiveness, but because she deserved her own peace. However, Olivia said, and saw hope flicker again in Patricia's eyes, desperate and pathetic, I'm not the person your son believed me to be. I'm not cruel despite having every reason to be. I'm not vindictive, though I have the resources to destroy his life as thoroughly as he tried to destroy mine. She wheeled to her desk, withdrew a business card, and handed it to Patricia. This is the contact information for my foundation's employment program. We help people who've made mistakes rebuild their professional lives. If Derek genuinely wants to change, if he's willing to undergo counseling, to take accountability for his actions, to demonstrate real growth and understanding of why his behavior was unacceptable, then he can apply through the proper channels like anyone else. Patricia stared at the card as though it might disappear. I'm not promising anything, Olivia clarified. He'll go through the same vetting process as every other applicant. He'll have to prove he's worth the investment. And if he gets in, he'll work for every single opportunity the program provides, without special treatment, without shortcuts, without any acknowledgement of his connection to me. I thank you, Patricia whispered. Don't thank me, Olivia said. I'm not doing this for Derek or for you. I'm doing this because my father spent his life believing that people deserve second chances if they're willing to earn them, and because I want to honor his memory by being the person he raised me to be, not the person Derek's betrayal almost turned me into. Patricia left shortly after, clutching the business card like a lifeline, and Olivia sat alone in her penthouse as the afternoon sun painted the city in shades of amber and gold. She thought about her father, about the empire he'd built in silence, about the lessons he'd taught her about dignity and strength and the difference between justice and revenge. She thought about Derek probably sitting in his mother's apartment at this very moment, waiting to hear whether his ex-wife, the woman he'd discarded like trash, would save him from the consequences of his own choices. And she thought about herself, about the journey from that hospital room where everything fell apart to this moment of power and clarity, about how suffering had revealed depths of resilience she hadn't known she possessed. 3 months later, Derek's application to the Foundation's employment program was denied. The review committee, who had no idea of his connection to Olivia, cited concerns about his failure to take genuine accountability for his past actions, noting that his essays and interviews showed more self-pity than self-awareness, more excuses than understanding. Olivia read the rejection letter without emotion, then filed it away and returned to her work. She had a foundation to run, research to fund, lives to change in ways that mattered. She had physical therapy sessions that were slowly, incrementally expanding her mobility, and a team of doctors exploring experimental treatments that might one day give her back what the accident had taken. She had a future that was hers alone to define, built not on the validation of others but on the solid foundation of her own worth and her father's incredible legacy. And that, she realized as she looked out over the city that was now hers, in ways Derek would never comprehend, was more than enough. The story of Olivia Matthews didn't end with revenge or reconciliation, didn't conclude with dramatic confrontations or tearful reunions. It simply continued day by day as she built a life that honored both the woman she'd been and the woman she was becoming, wealthier than most people could imagine, but more importantly, richer in the ways that actually mattered. And somewhere across the city, in a cramped apartment that smelled of failure and regret, Derek Collins learned the hardest lesson of his life, that some doors, once closed, remain locked forever, and that the price of cruelty is often paid in currencies that money can never purchase: loneliness, regret, and the permanent knowledge of what might have been if only he'd chosen differently when it mattered most. The inheritance we choose. 5 years after Patricia Collins walked out of that penthouse carrying a business card and a lesson in consequences, Olivia Matthews sat in a different conference room, this one at the headquarters of the Matthews Foundation for Accessibility and Human Dignity, a gleaming building in Lower Manhattan that she'd designed from the ground up with universal accessibility as its core principle. The foundation had grown beyond even her ambitious initial vision. What had started as a billion-dollar commitment to spinal injury research had evolved into a comprehensive organization that addressed the systemic barriers facing people with disabilities across every sector of society. But today's meeting was special, focused on reviewing the 5-year outcomes of their flagship program, the Second Chances Initiative. "We've served 3,147 individuals through the program," reported Dr. Amanda Chen, the Foundation's program director, pulling up data on the screen. "The retention rate is 73%, significantly higher than industry standards. Of those who completed the full program, 89% are still employed 2 years later, and average income has increased by 340%. Olivia scanned the statistics with satisfaction, but what caught her attention was the narrative summary section, the stories behind the numbers. There was Marcus, a former Wall Street trader who'd lost everything to addiction and had rebuilt his life as a financial literacy educator for underserved communities. There was Sarah, a teacher who'd been fired for whistleblowing on administrative corruption and now ran anti-retaliation training for school districts nationwide. There was James, convicted of white-collar crime at 25, who'd served his time and now headed the Foundation's Criminal Justice Reform Initiative. Each story was different, but they all shared common threads: genuine accountability, demonstrated growth, and commitment to using their second chances, not just to rebuild their own lives, but to help others avoid their mistakes. "What about the rejections?" Olivia asked. "What have we learned from those who didn't make it through the program?" Dr. Chen pulled up another dataset. "The primary predictor of failure isn't the severity of the original mistake, it's the individual's locus of control. Those who blame external circumstances, who see themselves primarily as victims, who haven't internalized their role in creating their situations, they almost universally fail to complete the program or succeed in placement." Olivia thought about Derek, about his rejection letter, about the reports she'd received through appropriate channels that he'd tried to reapply twice more, each application showing the same patterns of externalization and self-pity. The committee had rejected him each time, and Olivia had never intervened, trusting the process she'd created to function without her personal influence. "The data suggests something important," Dr. Chen continued. "Redemption isn't something we can give people. It's something they have to choose for themselves, and that choice requires a level of brutal honesty that many people never achieve: the power of boundaries." After the meeting, Olivia reviewed a case that had been flagged for her attention, not because it required her decision, but because the program coordinators thought she'd find it instructive. A woman named Rebecca had applied to the program after her husband divorced her. She'd been caught having an affair with her best friend's husband, and the resulting scandal had cost her both her marriage and her career in a small, tight-knit industry. Her application essay was remarkable in its honesty. "I destroyed 2 families because I was selfish and cowardly," Rebecca had written. "I told myself stories about true love and destiny to justify betraying people who trusted me. I blamed my marriage, blamed my ex-husband's work schedule, blamed everything except my own choices. It took losing everything, my marriage, my children's respect, my career, my reputation, to finally look in the mirror and see who I'd become. The essay continued for several pages, detailing not just what she'd done but why, examining the thought patterns and justifications that had allowed her to betray her values. She didn't ask for sympathy or make excuses. She simply laid out the truth and explained what she'd learned from the ruins of her life. The committee had accepted her into the program. Reading Rebecca's journey, Olivia reflected on something she'd learned in her own healing. Boundaries aren't punishment, they're protection. When she'd refused to help Derek, when she'd closed the door on Patricia's pleas, she hadn't been acting from cruelty, but from self-preservation and wisdom. Some people mistake kindness for an obligation to absorb abuse, to set themselves on fire to keep others warm. But true kindness, Olivia had learned, requires the discernment to know when helping someone actually enables their dysfunction, when forgiveness without accountability becomes complicity in ongoing harm. Derek hadn't needed her rescue. He'd needed to face the full consequences of his choices long enough to decide whether he wanted to change. So far, he'd chosen comfort over growth, chosen blame over accountability, and those were his decisions to make, but they didn't obligate her to cushion the impact. The disability paradox. One of the Foundation's most successful initiatives had become the Disability Leadership Institute, a program that trained people with disabilities for executive and leadership positions across industries. The resistance Olivia had encountered when launching this program had been illuminating. But won't it be harder for them? One well-meaning board member had asked. Don't we need to focus on helping them find appropriate work? The condescension was so ingrained, the speaker didn't even recognize it. Olivia had learned something profound through her own experience. Disability reveals society's limitations more than individual limitations. The world wasn't inaccessible because wheelchairs couldn't navigate it. The world was inaccessible because it had been designed without considering wheelchairs. The problem wasn't the disability. The problem was the assumptions about disability. She'd poured resources into changing those assumptions, funding adaptive technology research, creating architectural accessibility standards that went beyond legal minimums, and, most importantly, putting people with disabilities in positions of power and visibility where they could change the narrative themselves. The Disability Leadership Institute graduates were now CEOs, politicians, university presidents, and cultural influencers. They were changing industries from the inside, proving that limitation was often a failure of imagination rather than capability. Olivia herself had become something of an icon, though she'd resisted that role initially. She appeared on magazine covers, gave keynote speeches, and used her platform deliberately to challenge assumptions. But she also made sure never to be defined solely by her disability or her wealth. She was a complex person with interests ranging from modern art to quantum physics, from urban planning to culinary innovation. The wealth question. The most common question Olivia received in interviews was some variation of, "What's it like to have unlimited resources?" Her answer had evolved over the years into something more nuanced than people expected. Wealth solves certain problems, she'd say, but it creates others, and it reveals truths about human nature that can be uncomfortable to acknowledge. The truth she'd discovered was that money amplifies who you already are. It doesn't make cruel people kind or selfish people generous. It just gives them more resources to express their existing nature. She'd seen it in herself, in the moments when she'd been tempted to use her wealth as a weapon against Derek and Jennifer, when revenge had whispered seductively about the damage she could do. But her father had taught her through his choices and his letters that true wealth wasn't about accumulation, it was about impact. He'd lived modestly, not because he was cheap, but because he'd understood that money's value came from what it enabled you to build, create, and give, not from what it allowed you to consume. Olivia had created a personal spending rule. For every dollar she spent on herself, she committed $10 to the Foundation's work. This kept her grounded, kept her connected to purpose, kept the wealth from becoming an isolating bubble that separated her from human connection and meaning. The Jennifer question. 3 years after everything fell apart, Jennifer Morrison had sent Olivia a letter, not through lawyers or intermediaries, but a handwritten note delivered by regular mail to the Foundation's public address. The letter was 7 pages long, filled with apologies and explanations and pleas for forgiveness. Jennifer had enclosed photos of herself at what appeared to be an AA meeting, certificates from therapy programs, articles she'd written about betrayal and redemption. I've spent every day since then trying to understand how I became someone capable of such profound betrayal, Jennifer wrote. I've been in therapy 4 times a week for 2 years. I've lost friends, family connections, professional opportunities. I've sat with the full weight of what I did to you, to Derek's first marriage, to the person I thought I was. The letter didn't ask for reconciliation, didn't request money or help. It simply offered accountability and apologized without expectation of absolution. Olivia had sat with that letter for weeks, reading and rereading it, trying to discern whether it represented genuine transformation or sophisticated manipulation. She'd ultimately decided something important. It didn't matter whether Jennifer had truly changed or not, whether her remorse was genuine or performed. Olivia's healing didn't depend on understanding Jennifer's journey. She could acknowledge the apology without offering forgiveness, could recognize someone's growth without inviting them back into her life. She'd sent a brief response. I appreciate your honesty and hope you continue your healing journey. I won't be part of that journey, but I wish you well from a distance. No reconciliation, no door left open, but no cruelty either. Just clear boundaries and honest acknowledgement. Some of Olivia's friends had criticized this choice. But she's clearly changed, they'd argued. Doesn't she deserve another chance? This revealed another hard truth Olivia had learned. Forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation, and growth doesn't entitle someone to access they've destroyed. Jennifer might indeed have transformed into a better person. That was wonderful for her and for the people in her current life, but it didn't erase the past or obligate Olivia to provide a relationship that no longer served her well-being. Trust, once shattered at that level, couldn't be restored through apologies and time. Some breaks were permanent, and accepting that wasn't hardness. It was wisdom. The Derek aftermath. Through channels she wasn't proud of but also didn't regret, Olivia had kept loose tabs on Derek's trajectory, not obsessively, not vindictively, but with the clinical interest of someone studying the long-term consequences of choices. He'd eventually found work in a different industry, at a significantly lower level than where he'd been. He'd moved to a different city, apparently trying to escape his reputation. He'd entered therapy after his 3rd rejection from the Foundation, finally beginning the accountability work that might eventually lead to genuine transformation. He'd also started a blog about his experience, The Man Who Threw Away Everything, where he documented his journey with increasing honesty. The early posts had been full of self-pity and externalization, but the recent ones showed glimpses of real understanding. I've spent years blaming Olivia's disability for my unhappiness, one recent post read. But the truth is I was unhappy with myself, and I used her condition as an excuse to avoid examining my own character. I told myself I was trapped, that I was sacrificing my happiness, that I deserved better. I never once asked whether she deserved better than a husband who saw her as a burden rather than a partner. Olivia had read that post 3 times, searching for the manipulation she'd become adept at detecting. But it seemed genuine, written with the kind of painful self-awareness that couldn't be faked indefinitely. It didn't change her boundaries. It didn't make her want to reach out. But it did give her something unexpected. Hope that people could change if they genuinely wanted to, even if that change came too late to repair what they'd broken. The lessons for everyone on the 5th anniversary of her father's death. Olivia gave a speech at a major conference on disability rights and social justice, but she didn't talk about accessibility standards or legal frameworks. Instead, she talked about the human lessons her journey had taught her, lessons that applied far beyond her specific circumstances. The first lesson, she told the audience of thousands, is that crisis reveals character, it doesn't create it. When my husband left me 3 days after my father died, he wasn't becoming someone new. He was revealing who he'd always been under the surface. The stress of my disability and my grief simply removed the social constraints that had hidden his true nature. She paused, letting the words sink in. This means 2 things. First, pay attention to how people treat you when you're vulnerable, when you're struggling, when you can't offer them anything in return. That's who they really are. Second, understand that who you are in crisis is who you've been building yourself to be all along through small choices and daily habits. You don't suddenly become brave or kind or resilient in hard times. You reveal the bravery, kindness, and resilience you've been cultivating all along. The second lesson she shared was equally important. Forgiveness is not reconciliation. I've forgiven my ex-husband and my former best friend in the sense that I no longer carry active anger toward them, that I don't wish them harm, that I've released the emotional poison of sustained bitterness. But forgiveness doesn't mean I trust them again, doesn't mean I want them in my life, doesn't mean I pretend the betrayal didn't happen. She explained further. Our culture often conflates forgiveness with reconciliation, which creates enormous pressure on people who've been harmed to restore relationships with people who've hurt them. But these are separate processes. You can forgive someone for your own peace while maintaining boundaries for your own protection. In fact, sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for them is to let them experience the full consequences of their actions without rescuing them from the lessons they need to learn. The third lesson was perhaps the most nuanced. Some people need to lose everything before they can find themselves. My ex-husband's loss of his job, his marriage to my former friend, his reputation, these weren't punishments I inflicted. They were consequences he earned. And uncomfortable as it is to acknowledge, those consequences may have been exactly what he needed to begin genuine self-examination. Olivia shared how Derek's journey, from what she'd observed at a distance, suggested that sometimes the kindest long-term action is to let people face the full weight of their choices rather than cushioning the impact and enabling continued dysfunction. This doesn't mean we shouldn't help people, she clarified. It means we need wisdom to discern the difference between help that empowers growth and help that enables stagnation, between compassion that promotes healing and compassion that prevents accountability. The money lesson. But perhaps the most important lesson Olivia shared was about wealth itself, because her story had fascinated people largely because of the dramatic financial reversal. Money, she told the audience, is a magnifier, not a transformer. It doesn't make you generous if you're selfish, doesn't make you wise if you're foolish, doesn't make you happy if you're discontent with who you are. What it does is remove constraints, which means you become more purely yourself, for better or worse. She explained how inheriting her father's fortune had revealed something important. Derek and Jennifer hadn't left her because she was poor. They'd left because she was disabled. The money she later inherited wouldn't have changed their decision because their betrayal was about character, not economics. If anything, Olivia said, suddenly having unlimited resources made their betrayal a gift in disguise because it showed me exactly who they were before I invested more years in relationships built on conditional acceptance. They left when I was vulnerable, proving they'd never loved me fully, and then I discovered I had the resources to build an entirely new life without them. The timing was devastatingly painful, but ultimately perfect. She shared her personal philosophy about wealth. Money's value is measured by what it enables you to create, not what it allows you to consume. My father built a trillion-dollar fortune, but lived in a modest house and drove an old car because he understood this instinctively. He was rich in the ways that mattered, rich in purpose, rich in impact, rich in the knowledge that his wealth was a tool for positive change, not a scoreboard or a means of status. The disability wisdom. Finally, Olivia addressed the elephant in every room she entered, her wheelchair, her disability, the visible marker that had defined how people saw her, both before and after her wealth became known. "Here's what I've learned about disability," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the conference hall. "It's simultaneously the least important and most important thing about me." She explained the paradox. It's the least important because it doesn't define my intelligence, my character, my capacity to love and create and contribute. It's a fact about my body, not a fact about my worth or potential. People who reduce me to my disability, who see wheelchair instead of person, are revealing their own limitations, not mine. But it's also the most important thing about me because it's shaped my perspective in ways that inform everything I do. It's taught me about resilience, about systemic barriers, about the gap between how society says it values people and how it actually treats those who don't fit standard molds. It's given me empathy for anyone who's marginalized, overlooked, or underestimated. It's made me who I am. She paused, her next words carefully chosen. The accident that paralyzed me was a tragedy. The husband who abandoned me because of it was a revelation. The inheritance that came afterward was a responsibility. But the person I became through navigating all of it, that's a choice I made every single day. A choice to let hardship refine me rather than define me. The final word. Olivia concluded her speech with a challenge to the audience. Everyone faces betrayal, loss, and unexpected trials. Not everyone inherits a fortune, but everyone inherits something, whether it's trauma or wisdom, bitterness or resilience, cynicism or compassion. The real inheritance isn't what happens to you. It's who you choose to become because of it. My father left me money, yes, but more importantly, he left me an example of using resources, whatever resources you have, to create positive change. My ex-husband left me with trust issues and emotional scars, but also with clarity about my values and boundaries. My disability took away my ability to walk, but gave me insight into human nature and social systems that I might never have developed otherwise. She looked out over the sea of faces, some in wheelchairs like her, some standing, all of them carrying their own invisible struggles and triumphs. The question isn't whether hard things will happen to you. They will. The question is what inheritance you'll create from those experiences. Will you build walls or bridges? Will you hoard resources or invest them? Will you let your wounds fester or transform them into wisdom you can share? My ex-husband made his choice when he walked out. I made mine when I decided not to let his departure define my worth. Both of us are living with the inheritance we created through those choices. Choose wisely, Olivia concluded, because the inheritance you create through your character, your choices, your response to both fortune and hardship is the only one that truly belongs to you, the only one no one can take away, and the only one that will outlast your lifetime. The standing ovation lasted for 7 minutes, but Olivia was already thinking about the Foundation's next project, about the lives that would be changed, about the inheritance she was building one day, one choice, one act of purpose-driven compassion at a time. Because that's what true wealth looks like. Not a number in a bank account, but a life lived with intention, integrity, and impact that ripples far beyond any individual story. And that lesson, perhaps the most valuable inheritance her father had left her, was one she was determined to pass forward to everyone her life and work could touch.